This will have spoilers for the first two zones of Dawntrail as well as earlier expansions. There's been a great deal of discourse revolving around Dawntrail. Well before it was even out, Endwalker saw the end of a 10-year journey that had hundreds of hours of storytelling building up complex webs of characters, small stories, nations with internal and external disputes, and Dawntrail would be seeing a reset, bringing the Warrior of Light and the Scions to an entirely new continent that has only mild connection to all the lands we already know. One such being Erenville, a gleaner who was befriended during the Endwalker story. What was accomplished from the disaster of the original launch through the A Realm Reborn rebirth to the story's end is unprecedented in gaming history. But Dawntrail is coming at a time when Final Fantasy XIV is at its peak, and not entirely from scratch. This puts some high expectations on Dawntrail. Endwalker's launch story was an amazing climax, but the remainder, which was largely focused on tying up some loose ends, as well as a return to the world of darkness to search for Vritra's dragon sister, while also having a Final Fantasy IV storyline, while fine, it was a bit more poorly received, likely because it was not building up to anything, which is very different from other expects, where the patches both finish up the launch story and build up to the next expansion. So we already had a bit of a break after the Endwalker launch story, so going into Dawntrail we have a lot of emphasis on adventure and the new world, so expectations were we would be having a fairly light start with several new problems opening up to solve over the next several expansions. Everything would feel new and full of potential. The basis of Dawntrail early on is a tournament arc. We are to assist Wuk Lamat, the main character of Dawntrail, in becoming the next Dawn Servant as her father throws this tourney to choose the next leader of the nation. Early, it is clear what is going on. They build up the goal of having all four contestants learn more about the culture, but also confront their own weaknesses. It is by the numbers. It makes it fairly clear Wuk Lamat's opponents all have flaws to overcome. But for the first two zones, not very much happens regarding any of them. The MC is very obnoxious for a long time, with gay quirks, and is the center of attention without really having a good reason to like her. But for now, let's talk about everything else and get back to her at the end. The story is entirely based on discovering the cultures of the new land. It feels very structural and predictable, as the goal is to teach the competitors for the throne about the people. A wise king's goal, and the Dawn Servant is easily a likable mentor-type character right away, and they all have much to learn. At the same time as they are learning of these cultures, the player is doing the same, matching the pace of learning, which is somewhat strange when you consider to you this is the new world, but to them this is a place they have lived their entire lives. For a new story, a new start after a decade, it makes sense to do so, yet it does feel like they did not mask that they are doing it. In A Realm Reborn, for example, there were periods set aside for learning about the three main factions, and then sections for each of the beast races and their primals, with a consistent enemy of the Garleans and the Ascians, who remained enemies throughout most of the expansions. However, there were very different issues with each. A clear example is to consider how vastly the Sylph's problems are unlike those of the Suhagan. The way the Warrior of Light and nations deal with each is not the same. Limsa Lominsa is quite aggressive, for example, while the Gridanians prefer to only act when necessary and their home and forest is in danger. However, in this case, it really feels like there is no story developing. You are just there to be next to the hero, as the hero Wuk Lamat collects the gym badges, pendants for the Master Sword, each world's magic star, etc. While we were expecting to start the new journey with a simple, light story compared to the complex narrative we just finished, they went a bit extreme with how formulaic it was. A story about learning cultures has another problem due to the structure of Final Fantasy XIV, which has remained the same for some time, especially in Shadowbringers, Endwalker, and now Dawntrail. You follow the story with the MSQ, learn the twists and turns, deal with a crisis in each zone, return to it later on, and so on. And once you finish a zone, MSQ, side quests, crafting quests, and beast tribe quests unlock. And I would wager this is where far more of the problem lies than people realize. And most have felt this hurt their fun during Dawntrail without really understanding why. If you do the side quests, the crafting and gathering quests, the class quests, and so on for Dawntrail, it does the same thing it's always done in other expansions. It fills in the culture, the backstories of the people in the area, all the little details and so on for people who want more immersion and lore behind the scenes. It does an amazing job of filling out the small, non-world threatening tales of the people of each area, and it is brilliant because it caters to people who want that, while also being totally unneeded and skippable to those who don't, without harming the main storyline. Just consider that for a moment, and I'm sure you can now see where I'm going with this. In Dawntrail, though, it is very redundant. I was doing all of the side quests, but almost all their information was pretty much filled in by the MSQ, because they were all doing the same thing. Dawntrail's MSQ is going to feel painful for people because it is effectively a very long side quest chain. It's effectively the Mandervilles on steroids. Well, on more steroids, I guess. Consider this, if you love doing all the content, the side quests here do not add much variety. Yet some players tend to skip the side content because it does not interest them. Yet now they must do that sort of content that doesn't interest them. It ends up being less satisfying for both extremes of the player base. Another thing to consider is many went into Dawntrail thinking this would be a fun adventure. The ship imagery made many compare it to the freedom of One Piece. This, however, is not true. You are not on an adventure, your purpose is stuck to winning a tournament for someone else, and you are not exploring an unknown land, you are on a guided tour. And this is an incredibly important distinction. You learn of each group's culture from the position of them already being your friends, or at least friendly with your tour guides, and already having their problems mostly solved. So even though each culture is different, the way you interact with them as the Warrior of Light is the same. Dawntrail is almost like visiting a large theme park while being told bits and pieces, or one of those Amish simulated villages you went to during a school field trip. Learn about the Reed's harvest here, find out why the giants have a bunch of rocks, the new goblins live in big pots, and the merchants want you to find a golden llama. Compare that to ARR, which was our other time we were introduced to a new world. The way we interacted with each of the cultures was very different. Not only was each of the three main protagonist factions quite different, the conclusion of A Realm Reborn in Ul'dah, for example, is not mirrored anywhere else. But our interactions with the other cultures, the Beastman, is extremely varied. We are very antagonistic with the Swahagan, which makes them the hardest to finally find some common ground with, while the Sylphs are our friends right away. We even have a Sylph ally in the Scions. Briefly. It makes it not only a lore difference for our questing in the coast versus the forest, but our gameplay interactions are quite different as well, and it takes multiple X-Packs to solve some of the problems each group has. In Dawntrail, you behave pretty much the same with each race you learn of for the MSQ, and then the side quests are more of the same. Because the MSQ feels like a long side quest, it is hard to get into it the same way. Again, we are talking about the first two zones for now, but an early impression is quite vital. Stakes feel low for a good chunk of it. Also, it really sucks that every time the group of your companions that you've known for some time start to split up to do varied tasks, which, by the way, happens quite constantly and fairly artificially. You always end up with Wuk Lamat, and this is a large issue because no other X-Pack ever does this. Your allies are always changing up, you are not stuck to the hip in any other case, except for maybe Alphanod for a period. And in fairness, people also did not like Alphanod early on. So in another expansion, even with Wuk Lamat being so annoying, it would not have been as overbearing. But at least early on, when you do the let us pick a partner for sports class gimmick, which you constantly do in the tournament, you are always picked last, and yes, always with Wuk Lamat, unless there is a very brief point where you need to team up with someone else specifically so they can give their thoughts on Wuk Lamat. I finally fully understand Nero in the Praetorium right now complaining about how everything is about Sidnan Bloody Garland. I do not see what this is building up long term. Most of the issues from ARR took multiple X-Packs to resolve. It basically takes till Endwalker to become friends with the Swahagan, for example. I don't think there's going to be anything left to solve with any of the groups that are introduced here early on. Though that may change with later zones, which means in the next expansion, if it's like this, it will likely once again have to fully introduce a new group. A Realm Reborn was put together quickly as they were trying to fix a train wreck, yet it did far more to set up the future. Most of the beast tribes are still at odds, the Garlean Empire issues last until Endwalker, the primals are considered a problem until Endwalker. You know there's issues with the dragons and with Ishgard being closed off. There's of course a ton of problems with the finale of A Realm Reborn and with the traders of the Crystal Braves. Even early on, you can tell there's a massive amount of different threads that are going to take years to sort out. Is Dawntrail bad early on? No. If we compare it to the average MMO, this is still a dedicated story that has no equal. However, if we compare it to itself, in terms of story and character building early on, this is weaker than A Realm Reborn and all the expansions, and it is natural for people, even if they enjoy Dawntrail, which I do by the way, to compare it to other parts of the game. There are some shining points, 2 new classes, and definitely the Pictomancer has become very popular very quickly. The dungeon and bosses are all excellent, their design is fun to fight against, and there is a challenge increase. There even is potential for it being some of the best group content yet. MSQ continues to have many solo battles that are much more difficult than just killing a few open world mobs. Outside of the story aspect, Dawntrail seems quite strong. It also brought in a very nice graphical update that made a game that already looks pretty nice in most cases even better. but it did not have to change character models to the extreme degree we saw in something like the World of Warcraft changes. However, there is an elephant in the room. Well, not an elephant, we had those in Endwalker. A mewling cat elephant, Wuk Lamat. Final Fantasy XIV has had some divisive characters, but it always gives you a cast that you spend balanced time with. So even if you don't like Urianger, for example, it's not like you'll be spending more time with him than Y'shtola, the most superior scion. Wuk Lamat is front and center all the time, and the story of Dawntrail early on is specifically about her. You are basically just her entourage. Aside from learning a few new things, there's no real growth, and it is hard to say learning is character growth when it is shared between everyone in the party. Wuk Lamat does not grow, and she is in that position from the start where she is so likable, she is very hard to like. She has perfect character syndrome, all positive personality traits, a bubbly, goofy anime protagonist gag filler content, like the motion sickness and being overly excited all the time. If I told you the first anime protagonist that comes to mind, you would not believe it. She is kind, loves her people, wants peace at any cost, and is eager to learn more about culture. There is no conflict here. She is already where she needs to be in every way, aside from not being physically powerful enough to beat her opponents. Our goal is to do the things she already wants to do, and she tackles the problems each judge of the tournament gives her in the correct way. There is no moral, attitude, or character flaw, conflict, or error she needs to overcome. She does not even have the common heroic flaw of arrogance. She is driven, sticks to her values, and at this point the question is, what do you mean she is hard to like? She sounds like she doesn't have a single thing about her that is unlikable. Dawntrail is about Wuk Lamat. This is a story about her likely becoming the next Dawn servant. Her character is fully focused upon, yet Kona is the one who needs to learn to respect his people's culture, as he is too driven to replace it with efficient foreign machinery and ideas. Zoral Jah's war ambitions need to be curtailed, and we will need to explore what sort of post-trauma drove him to be so obsessed with bringing war to all the other continents. And even the villains, the blessed siblings, Bakul Jaja, while they do seem like rough bullies, there is probably some potential for them to get humbled. Yet Wuk Lamat, who has more than the lion's share of the spotlight early in Dawntrail, while in an underdog position from her power and popularity, it is hard to see which lessons she needs to learn. Her potential to change seems limited. It is one thing to have an unchanging character that is well liked, yet while she does have fans, as just about any character does, the amount of people who dislike her is way too high for such a central character, and the amount of which she is disliked is also well above the norm. This is a problem because all the chips of Dawntrail's early success are completely on her due to how vital she is, and she has been widely rejected. I can talk about whether the hatred for her is fair or not, but it doesn't really matter. They went all in on Wuk Lamat, and she is one of the most disliked characters so far. And out of major characters, I think it is deserved. I dislike spending time with her. I'm not particularly interested in what happens to her, and I don't even really want her winning the competition. I feel like Kona has far better ideas for becoming Dawn Servant, and if Zoral Jah were to have his temper quenched, he seems like the more reliable replacement. So right now I'm rooting for Wuk Lamat is if it come down to her and Bakul Jaja. If I were in her world, she is the obvious choice. She'd make a great friend. She seems lovely. But as a lead in a story, she needs to have some sort of growth, some sort of story to her. And the focus is on a new adventure. There is no hook here, no interest, and the only saving grace is in cutscenes. My Warrior of Light gives a look like an adult eyeing a child's antics every time Wuk Lamat does a gag. And sadly, there is no comedy, and watching someone else's jokes continue to fail constantly to land, I at least get what my warrior is thinking in this case. On the other hand, we do have a tractor motorcycle. It is from the last expansion, but still, this mount is pretty cool.